the death and initial betrayal. When my father died, the world didn't stop. It only moved around me, faster, heavier, as if the air itself conspired to remind me that life went on whether I was ready or not. I was 26, still his only biological child, and I had always believed that what belonged to me would remain untouched. I had been wrong. The moment the ambulance left our driveway, the moment the paramedics closed the door and left, my stepmother Lydia became the shadow of control that stretched over everything I had once called mine. She didn't shout, she didn't cry. She smiled tightly as if her grief were rehearsed, as if her heartache had been designed for display. People at the funeral called her devoted, loyal, tragic. They didn't see the calculation behind the soft sobs, the perfectly timed gestures, the way she positioned herself at the front of every photograph, every chair, every arrangement of flowers. They didn't notice that the estate, my father's empire, my childhood home, every asset he had accumulated over decades, was quietly being rewritten. 3 days later, she called me to the dining room, the room where my father read the morning paper, where his hands always rested on polished oak as he drank his coffee. She slid a folder across the table. "Your father trusted me to manage things responsibly," she said, her tone honeyed, controlled. The folder contained legal documents I had never seen, trust amendments, new executor arrangements, temporary authority granted to her over the estate. "Until matters are resolved," she said. "Cooperate," she had said, and the word burned in my ears. It was not a request. It was a warning. I nodded, polite, careful, and walked away that evening knowing that the battle had already begun. Over the next few weeks, her methods were subtle but relentless. Accounts I had always accessed were temporarily restricted. Staff I had known since childhood were quietly replaced with people loyal to her, unknown to me. Advisors who had guided my father for decades stopped answering my calls. Every interaction with her carried the weight of expectation, compliance, the illusion that I was the overwhelmed, grieving son who had no choice but to submit. I didn't respond with anger. I didn't confront her. I observed. Every email she sent, every meeting she arranged, every signature she coerced or delayed became a thread in the web she was weaving. And every thread I noted. Every misstep, every overreach, every assumption of immunity. Then I found the notebook. Tucked into a shelf my father used for private planning, a place only someone who knew him well enough to look there would think to check. Inside was a short, almost cryptic message. "If anything happens suddenly, don't accept the first version of events. Check the amendments. You'll know which ones aren't mine." My hands shook when I read it, not from fear but confirmation. My father had suspected her. He had left me a trail and now it was my turn to follow it. I didn't confront Lydia. I let her believe I was disengaging, overwhelmed, passive. I played the role she expected, all the while reconstructing every detail. Bank statements, trust amendments, emails, notary dates, minor witnesses who had observed her influence. Every document was a potential weapon, every small discrepancy a point of leverage. She believed herself untouchable because she controlled perception. She didn't understand that patience and observation are power too. Each week, I subtly countered her moves, questioning documents, requesting verification, making small inquiries that seemed innocent but slowly unspooled the narrative she had tried to control. She never noticed. She was always one step behind, confident in her assumed authority, blind to the patience I had cultivated. The first real test came during a casual coffee in the library, a space she had once claimed as shared family territory. "Elias," she said, smiling, rehearsed and polished, "I'm only trying to honor your father's wishes." I looked her in the eye, calm, measured, and replied, "I'm sure. I just hope he would have approved these changes himself." Her smile faltered. Not fully but enough. From that moment, the tension between us became a quiet war. Each document she forged, each delay she orchestrated, each subtle coercion I observed only confirmed one truth. I would not be displaced and she would not succeed. Months passed in this silent contest. I assembled a quiet team, a forensic accountant, a discreet attorney, advisors who could be trusted not to speak prematurely. We mapped every transaction, every signature, every amendment. We anticipated every maneuver Lydia might attempt. She had assumed that my grief would render me passive. She had underestimated the combination of patience and knowledge. By the third month, the cracks in her control were already forming. Staff began questioning her instructions. Documents began to reveal inconsistencies. Emails she assumed private were traced to accurate timestamps and witnesses. She still did not see me as a threat. She smiled, she reassured, she manipulated, but she never noticed that I was preparing a perfect, patient reversal. My story was no longer only about grief or inheritance. It was about strategy, observation, and measured justice. The war had begun quietly, and it would end with precision. I would not be forced out of the life my father had built. I would not be removed from the home, the estate, or the legacy he had entrusted to me. Every small move Lydia made would be catalogued, every flaw preserved, every subtle overreach noted. She would not need to be humiliated. Her undoing would be inevitable. And I would wait quietly until the right moment. Months passed and the quiet war continued. Lydia believed she had absolute control, but every decision she made, every document she signed, every temporary transfer she claimed to execute was being quietly monitored. I moved carefully, deliberately, never revealing the depth of my awareness. I played the grieving son, the overwhelmed heir, the one who seemed too passive to oppose her. Meanwhile, I reconstructed the estate piece by piece. Bank statements, trust amendments, minor witness accounts, signatures, all cross-referenced and catalogued. I discovered small manipulations she had attempted before I even realized the significance. She had planned her moves meticulously, yet she underestimated the value of patience and knowledge. I began meeting secretly with a forensic accountant who specialized in estate audits, someone who could see through layers of legal camouflage. Every transaction Lydia had made was analyzed. Every adjustment she claimed authority over was traced back to a timeline she could not manipulate. I also quietly consulted with a discreet attorney who understood the nuances of trust law, someone who could act immediately when the moment arrived. I had learned from my father's notes that his intentions had been carefully outlined, but he had not anticipated the subtlety of Lydia's ambition. That was my advantage. Meanwhile, Lydia's confidence grew. She had no reason to suspect that I was cataloging every move she made, that I had created backups of every temporary transfer, every email, every signed amendment. She believed she was untouchable because no one else questioned her. She believed that grief made me pliable. She was wrong. One evening, as she was reviewing the estate's accounts with the staff, she left her office door slightly ajar. I stepped in silently, reviewing the files she had just approved. The discrepancies were subtle but undeniable. A misdated document here, a small unauthorized transfer there, a notary signature she had presumed correct but misapplied. I noted everything. I knew that if I confronted her too early, she would retreat, hide her errors, or manipulate new documents. Timing was everything. I also began to notice behavioral patterns. Lydia relied on perception, not law, to maintain control. She charm-controlled staff and advisors, using polite language, reassurances, soft threats for the estate's well-being. She manipulated appearances. She even manipulated me, hoping I would internalize helplessness. But I remained patient, calm, composed. I observed her, learned her habits, anticipated her moves. Her reliance on social perception was a weakness, one I intended to exploit. The first real confrontation was subtle. I invited her to a casual discussion in the library, the same room she had claimed as shared family space. She arrived confident, expecting another routine check-in, another moment to assert her authority. "Elias," she said, smiling rehearsed, "I'm only trying to honor your father's wishes." I looked her straight in the eye, calm, measured, and replied, "I'm sure. I just hope he would have approved these changes himself." Her expression faltered slightly, a crack in the practiced facade. She tried to regain composure, but the damage was done. After that meeting, the tension between us intensified. Lydia became slightly careless, small mistakes appearing in the documents she had once handled flawlessly. She began delegating more to staff she assumed loyal, failing to notice their growing uncertainty. I seized on these opportunities. Each discrepancy I discovered, each witness who could testify to her manipulations, was documented meticulously. I never confronted her directly, only allowed her overconfidence to work against her. Weeks later, I scheduled a formal estate review, ostensibly routine. Lydia arrived, confident, documents in hand, ready to present revised allocations. What she didn't know was that my attorney and forensic accountant were sitting beside me, prepared to challenge every assertion, expose every inconsistency, and reveal the precise manipulations she had attempted. One by one, her assertions unraveled. Each amendment she had relied on as absolute was shown to contain errors or misrepresentations. Transactions she had initiated without proper authority were flagged. Witnesses she assumed loyal provided statements contradicting her narrative. Her smile faded as the meeting progressed. Every claim she had believed secure was systematically exposed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shout. I simply presented facts, evidence, and patiently waited as the truth unfolded. By the end of the session, she realized she no longer had control. She had miscalculated, underestimated patience, and overlooked the importance of thorough documentation. She left the room silent, her authority gone. That day marked the turning point. The estate gradually returned under proper oversight. Lydia retained a minimal inheritance, a token to preserve appearances, but she no longer held power over property, finances, or decision-making. The house, the staff, the advisors, all returned to rightful control. Every subtle attempt she had made to manipulate perception or isolate me had been neutralized quietly, surgically, without drama, without humiliation. In the aftermath, I walked through the house, once tense with conflict and control, now calm, familiar, and restored. Sunlight streaming through the tall windows illuminated the spaces my father had once occupied. The war had been won not with anger or confrontation, but with patience, strategy, and observation. I had honored my father's legacy, preserved the estate, and neutralized the stepmother's manipulations without descending to her level. I realized finally the truth about power and revenge. Loud confrontations and public humiliation may satisfy momentarily, but patient, calculated justice, backed by knowledge and evidence, is far more enduring. Lydia's undoing was inevitable because she had underestimated the one thing she could not control: deliberate, patient observation. She had acted thinking she could manipulate everyone around her, including me, and had failed because I had anticipated, documented, and prepared. Months later, life returned to a quiet normal. Staff and advisors were realigned. Minor conflicts were resolved. The estate, the home, and the legacy my father had built were secure. Lydia moved away quietly, her influence over the family completely removed. I never gloated, never humiliated her publicly. The victory was in balance restored, in justice achieved, in the inevitable consequence of manipulations undone by careful planning. The greatest inheritance my father left me was not money or property. It was awareness, patience, and discernment. It was the ability to observe, to wait, to calculate, and to act at the precise moment. It was the understanding that revenge is quiet, measured, and enduring. I had been tested, isolated, manipulated, and challenged. I had been underestimated. And yet, in the end, I stood intact, unshaken, and victorious, not because I had sought vengeance with fury, but because I had mastered patience, evidence, and strategy. The story of Lydia Mercer and her failed attempt to seize what was never hers would never be loud, never dramatic. It would exist quietly, in records, in truth, in the irreversible consequences she had set in motion by underestimating me. After the formal review, Lydia retreated into calculated silence. She no longer smiled with the same confidence, and the subtle manipulations that had once flowed effortlessly now faltered. I watched her from a distance, patient as ever, knowing that desperation often reveals more than planning ever could. She attempted small acts of control, delaying document signings, quietly whispering to advisors, sending subtle threats through legal intermediaries, but every move was anticipated, every tactic countered without confrontation. I had learned from my father that control relies on perception, and her perception of power was crumbling. I continued my meticulous documentation. Every misstep, every inconsistency, every attempt to manipulate or intimidate was catalogued. I also began observing her interactions with the staff, noting whom she trusted and whom she manipulated. It became apparent that her influence had always been superficial, maintained only through carefully curated appearances and the illusion of authority. Once that illusion began to crack, the structure she had built around herself collapsed quietly, without the drama she had hoped for. One morning she approached me directly, attempting to assert control with a polite, rehearsed tone. "Elias," she said, holding a folder as if it were a shield, "I think we should discuss the allocations again. I only want what is fair." I looked at her calmly, unwavering. "Fairness is not determined by appearances or timing," I replied. "It's determined by the truth your actions cannot undo." The words were simple, but they carried weight, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. Her next maneuvers grew more desperate. She sought to influence advisors, hoping to create pockets of loyalty, but they had already observed her inconsistencies and were quietly reporting back to me. I allowed her these attempts, knowing that every effort to regain control would only create more evidence, more undeniable proof of her manipulations. Each time she overreached, I reinforced my patience, my observation, my strategy. During this period, I reflected on the nature of revenge and justice. I realized that true power does not need to be loud or dramatic. It is patient, deliberate, and calculated. Lydia had relied on fear and appearance, assuming I would react with emotion or be overwhelmed by grief. She did not understand that deliberate observation and methodical preparation can be far more powerful than fury. Weeks later, the final stage of resolution began. I arranged for the estate's assets to be reviewed once again, ensuring that every account, every property, every legal document was scrutinized by independent, trustworthy parties. Lydia arrived confident, believing she could influence outcomes through charm or persuasion. But her efforts were futile. Every flaw in her management, every unauthorized action, every attempt at control was exposed systematically, quietly, irrefutably. She could no longer manipulate perception, could no longer project authority, and could no longer hide behind the facade of widowhood and loyalty. The final legal settlement restored full control to me. Lydia retained only a minimal inheritance, a symbolic gesture to preserve appearances in public eyes, but her influence over the estate, the house, and the staff was gone. The victory was complete, silent, and permanent. She had been outmaneuvered not with shouting, confrontation, or revenge-fueled actions, but with patient observation, strategic documentation, and deliberate timing. In the days following, I walked through the house, now restored to order, noticing details that had once gone overlooked. The sunlight through the windows, the arrangement of books and photographs, the calm of rooms no longer filled with tension. The estate was secure, the staff aligned, and the manipulative influence of Lydia Mercer finally neutralized. The quiet victory resonated deeper than any public spectacle of revenge could have. I reflected on the lessons learned. Patience, observation, strategy, and adherence to truth are far more effective than anger or impulsive retaliation. Those who rely on appearances, charm, and subtle manipulation often fail when confronted with deliberate, methodical, and patient opposition. My father's legacy had been preserved not through confrontation, but through careful, strategic action guided by his teachings and the evidence he had left for me. Lydia moved away quietly, her presence no longer a threat. I did not gloat, did not humiliate her. The satisfaction came from balance restored, from justice quietly served, and from knowing that every move she had made in her attempt to seize what was never hers had been anticipated, countered, and neutralized. In the end, the greatest inheritance my father had left me was not money, property, or titles. It was the understanding that power is not loud or aggressive. It is quiet, deliberate, and patient. Revenge does not always need to be dramatic to be complete. The estate was secure, the staff loyal, the home restored, and I, Elias Mercer, stood intact, unshaken, and wiser than before. The story of Lydia Mercer's failed attempt to seize what was never hers would remain quiet, yet enduring. It was a testament to the power of patience, observation, and methodical action. The lesson was clear. Those who underestimate the quiet, who assume passivity equals weakness, often fall first. And with that, the chapter of loss, betrayal, and patient vengeance came to a close, leaving behind only restored order, clarity, and the quiet satisfaction of justice served without spectacle. Even after Lydia had lost control of the estate, her presence lingered like a shadow. Staff members whispered quietly about her manipulations, some still feeling the subtle weight of her coercion. I knew that in order to truly restore balance, I needed to address not just the estate's documents, but the human element she had twisted. I began meeting individually with the long-term staff, housekeepers, accountants, family advisors, reassuring them, clarifying their roles, and most importantly validating the actions they had witnessed. Their loyalty had been tested, but their trust could be rebuilt through transparency and patient leadership. The first few days were tense. Some staff feared retaliation from Lydia if they openly admitted to her manipulations. Others were uncertain if I would react harshly to past mistakes made under pressure. I maintained calm, addressing each concern methodically. "Your honesty now matters more than compliance under fear ever did," I told them, and slowly the atmosphere began to shift. The household felt lighter, as if the air itself had been freed from tension. Lydia, aware that her influence had slipped, attempted subtle communication. A note here, a call there, trying to suggest reconciliation. But I had no intention of letting her interfere further. I maintained polite distance while ensuring every legal and practical barrier prevented her from regaining control. Each attempt she made was noted, catalogued, and filed, not out of vengeance but as protection. She no longer had authority, but her persistence revealed the depth of her ambition and the potential for future disruption if left unchecked. In parallel, I turned my attention to the estate itself. Lydia had assumed that hurriedly changing trust documents and transferring minor assets would escape scrutiny. I meticulously cross-checked every property, every account, and every financial instrument. Even the smallest discrepancies were corrected, ensuring that the estate reflected my father's true intentions. I also implemented oversight measures, independent audits, multiple signature approvals, and transparent reporting structures, to prevent any future attempts at covert manipulation. Amidst the practical restoration, I spent time reflecting on the psychological battle that had unfolded. Lydia had relied on charm, fear, and appearances, believing that grief would make me malleable. I had learned that patience, observation, and evidence could counter even the most subtle forms of manipulation. Revenge had not been about confrontation. It had been about anticipating every move, quietly documenting every action, and acting at the precise moment to restore balance. This understanding reshaped not only my approach to the estate, but my view of human behavior itself. One morning, Lydia arrived at the estate under the pretext of returning personal belongings. She carried herself with forced composure, as if every gesture were measured to avoid angering me. I met her in the foyer, calm, observing. "Everything has been settled according to your father's intentions," I said. She paused, studying me, searching for a reaction, a sign of weakness. Finding none, she nodded curtly and left, her influence entirely nullified. There was no confrontation, no dramatics. The moment itself was quiet, almost mundane, but it carried the weight of irreversible consequence. In the weeks that followed, life at the estate returned to normal. Staff regained confidence, advisors operated openly, and the household began to reflect the stability my father had always intended. I took time to revisit personal spaces, my father's study, the library, the garden, places he had loved. Each corner held memories, but also lessons about patience, observation, and the careful management of authority. I realized that the true inheritance had never been material wealth alone. It was knowledge, discipline, and the understanding of human nature. I also reflected on Lydia herself. She had been clever, ambitious, and manipulative, but ultimately her weakness was impatience and over-reliance on perception. She underestimated the value of patience, the inevitability of carefully documented truth, and the quiet power of a mind prepared for strategy. In defeating her, I did not seek humiliation or vindictiveness. I allowed consequence, inevitability, and meticulous preparation to achieve what brute force or anger never could. By the end of this chapter, the estate was secure, the staff loyal, and the house itself free from tension. I had restored not only material control but emotional and psychological balance. Every aspect of my father's legacy was preserved, every manipulation neutralized, and every subtle threat contained. Lydia Mercer, once a figure of looming authority, had become powerless not through dramatic confrontation but through calculated patience, observation, and strategic action. I spent long evenings alone reflecting on the battle. Revenge had been quiet, deliberate, and patient. It had been about observation rather than emotion, strategy rather than impulsiveness. I understood now that true power and security come not from intimidation, charm, or aggression, but from foresight, patience, and meticulous preparation. Lydia had taught me that lesson in her own way. By attempting to take everything, she revealed precisely how I should act to preserve it. In the quiet aftermath, I felt a sense of completion. The estate was restored, the household harmonious, and the legacy my father entrusted to me secure. More than that, I had grown, aware of human nature, resilient to manipulation, and confident in the strength of measured, deliberate action. Revenge had not been loud, dramatic, or vengeful. It had been inevitable, quiet, and enduring. And in that quiet, I finally understood what my father had meant when he spoke of patience, observation, and the subtle power of truth. The house was mine, the legacy intact, and I, Elias Mercer, had emerged not only victorious but enlightened, carrying forward lessons far beyond material inheritance. By the following month, Lydia's desperation became tangible. Her subtle attempts at influence had failed, her charm no longer disarmed anyone, and the staff she had once thought loyal were now aligned with truth and transparency. She tried sending letters, drafting post-dated legal claims, and subtly coercing minor advisors to intervene on her behalf, but each move was anticipated. I had already prepared for these contingencies, every possible legal angle covered, every document double-checked, every advisor quietly aware of her manipulations. She was acting out of instinct now, not strategy. One afternoon, she attempted to confront me directly in the study, the same room where my father's presence lingered in photographs, in books, in the weight of his absence. "Elias," she said, voice measured but edged with tension, "I'm only trying to claim what is rightfully mine. Surely you understand fairness." I looked at her steadily, unflinching. "What is rightfully yours is what has been determined," I said calmly. "Everything beyond that is your choice to accept gracefully or continue to manipulate at your own peril." She faltered, realizing that her usual tactics of charm, subtle fear, and persuasion were powerless. In the weeks that followed, she made one final series of maneuvers. She attempted to influence local authorities, quietly challenged minor clauses in the trust, and even sought to pressure staff into supporting her narrative. Each of these moves backfired. My team, composed of legal experts, accountants, and long-trusted advisors, ensured that every action she took was documented, countered, and neutralized. She could no longer manipulate perception. The law, evidence, and truth had formed an impenetrable shield. Meanwhile, I took the time to reflect on the nature of her failure. Lydia had been clever, ruthless, and determined, but she had relied too heavily on appearances and the assumption that others would act predictably. She had never accounted for observation, patience, or preparation. Her mistakes, small and incremental, had compounded under the quiet scrutiny I maintained. Her overconfidence had blinded her to the reality of strategy grounded in knowledge and foresight. Eventually, Lydia's efforts dwindled. Her claims were dismissed, her letters unanswered, her influence evaporated. She moved away quietly, leaving the estate entirely in my control. There was no confrontation, no dramatics, no public humiliation. Her power had been neutralized through careful, methodical action, and the consequences of her manipulations were absolute. The staff, once fearful, regained confidence. The household returned to harmony. The estate, fully aligned with my father's original intentions, was secure. In the aftermath, I reflected deeply on the lessons embedded in the struggle. Revenge, I realized, need not be loud or emotional to be effective. Patience, careful observation, and strategic action can dismantle even the most insidious manipulations. Lydia had attempted to control, intimidate, and deceive, but she had failed because she underestimated the quiet power of deliberate preparation and methodical execution. The satisfaction came not from witnessing her fall in spectacle, but from knowing that her actions had been anticipated, her influence nullified, and her manipulations irreversibly countered. I also considered the broader implications. The conflict had taught me about human nature, ambition, and the subtle ways people attempt to control others. Those who manipulate through appearances and fear may seem powerful, but their over-reliance on perception is their vulnerability. Observation, patience, and documentation reveal truth and expose weaknesses. I had preserved not only the estate but the moral and structural integrity of my father's legacy. The final days of the struggle were quiet. Lydia's presence faded, the estate operated smoothly, and staff and advisors functioned openly and honestly. I took long walks through the house, revisiting the library, the garden, my father's study, absorbing the lessons in patience, foresight, and quiet authority. I had been tested, challenged, and manipulated, but I emerged stronger, wiser, and fully aware of the subtle mechanisms of power and influence. In the end, the story was not about anger, confrontation, or dramatic revenge. It was about inevitability, balance, and strategic foresight. Lydia Mercer had overestimated herself and underestimated the patient, deliberate force of observation and preparation. I had acted not out of rage, but out of methodical adherence to truth, law, and foresight. The victory was complete, enduring, and quiet, just as true justice often is. As I walked through the estate one last evening, sunlight streaming through the windows, I reflected on the transformation. I was no longer the naive heir, overwhelmed by grief and manipulation. I was a careful observer, a strategist, a guardian of legacy. Every corner of the house, every document, every relationship within the estate had been tested, preserved, and restored. The battle had been long and subtle, but the resolution was absolute. And in that quiet, deliberate victory, I understood fully, patience, observation, and strategic action are more powerful than fury. The true inheritance my father left me was not just material wealth, but the knowledge, discipline, and discernment to protect it. Lydia Mercer, once a formidable threat, had been neutralized without spectacle, leaving only the enduring truth of careful, deliberate justice. The final weeks after Lydia's departure were marked by calm, yet the lessons lingered like echoes in the house. The estate, once a battlefield of subtle manipulation, was restored not only in structure and documents but in spirit. Staff no longer feared whispers or hidden agendas. Advisors acted with transparency. Every property, every account, every trust clause reflected my father's intentions. I walked through the rooms he had loved, the garden paths he had tended, feeling the weight of his foresight and the quiet satisfaction of fulfillment. In solitude, I reflected on the subtle war that had been fought and won. Lydia had been cunning, ambitious, manipulative, but she had relied on assumptions, appearances, and the belief that grief could be weaponized against me. I had relied on patience, careful observation, and methodical documentation. Her every attempt had been catalogued, anticipated, and countered, not through confrontation but through deliberate strategy. The quiet power of preparation had undone the loud illusions of authority she had tried to create. I spent hours revisiting my father's study, examining his old notes, letters, and journals. He had taught me the value of foresight, the importance of watching quietly, and the subtle art of balancing patience with action. Everything he left behind had prepared me for this moment, not only to reclaim what was mine by right, but to preserve the integrity of the legacy entrusted to me. I realized that the greatest inheritance was not material wealth, nor control of the estate, but the understanding of human nature, the knowledge that power can be quiet, and that patience often outlasts ambition. I also reflected on the psychological dimension of revenge and justice. Revenge need not be loud, destructive, or performative to be effective. The most enduring justice is quiet, methodical, and inevitable. Lydia's ambition, her overconfidence, and her reliance on perception had blinded her to the inevitability of evidence, foresight, and patient action. In the end, her fall was not dramatic. It was silent, precise, and permanent. And that silence carried more weight than any confrontation could have. Life gradually returned to a sense of normalcy. Staff and advisors functioned openly and honestly, minor conflicts were resolved, and the estate's operations reflected the harmony my father had always envisioned. I took long walks through the garden, sitting in my father's study, observing the sunlight filtering through the windows, feeling the quiet solidity of restored balance. For the first time in months, I could breathe without tension, knowing the estate, its people, and its legacy were secure. Even now, I remained vigilant, not out of paranoia but because vigilance is the foundation of lasting security. I knew that others, tempted by ambition or manipulation, might one day attempt to test boundaries, but the lessons from Lydia's attempt were etched into every system, every policy, and every relationship. I had learned that observation, patience, and preparation are more formidable than impulsive reaction or emotional confrontation. The emotional closure was profound. I had faced betrayal, deception, and subtle aggression, yet I emerged intact, confident, and deeply aware. Lydia Mercer, who had seemed unstoppable, had been outmaneuvered by deliberate, careful strategy. The satisfaction was quiet, internal, and lasting. It was not gloating, not vindictive. It was the enduring knowledge that injustice, when met with patience, observation, and strategic action, is inevitably corrected. As I reflected on the entire ordeal, I realized that the inheritance had transformed me. I was no longer simply Elias Mercer, heir to an estate. I was a careful observer of human nature, a strategist capable of neutralizing subtle manipulations, and a guardian of integrity. The lessons of patience, foresight, and deliberate action would guide me far beyond the walls of this house. In the end, the story of Lydia Mercer's attempt to seize what was never hers would remain largely unseen by the public eye, but its consequences were absolute. The estate, the household, and the legacy of my father were preserved. Manipulation, ambition, and overconfidence had been defeated, not through drama, anger, or confrontation, but through the quiet, methodical, and inevitable power of patience, observation, and strategic action. I walked through the estate one last evening, the sunset casting golden light over the gardens and hallways. Everything was in its rightful place, every injustice quietly corrected, every consequence fully realized. I understood, in a way I never had before, the depth of my father's foresight, the value of careful observation, and the enduring power of strategic patience. The war had ended. The estate was secure. The legacy preserved. And I, Elias Mercer, stood not only victorious but enlightened, carrying forward lessons far beyond material inheritance, a quiet, deliberate mastery of patience, power, and enduring justice.